leaving for the States. And part of that is because um, the coup had started to really unravel, and it started to get a little bit more intense. And the Tonto coup we knew about, but where we were, we weren't really affected until our next door neighbor decided to join the Tonto coup. And so he walked into the yard one day wearing a uniform that we had associated with the Tonto coup. And so all of a sudden that changed, because we knew what that meant. And so we weren't allowed to go to his house anymore. We definitely were cautious about what we said, and where we hung around. And I was 9 years old then. And so I think as a kid, I was I was aware of a lot of things, and I took a lot of things in, and I started to process those internally. Often when I talk to my students, I often say that, a poet starts to write a poem way before the pen hits the page. It's how the poet gathers information, it's how they process it. And so I feel like I had a lot of information that I was gathering. I didn't know for what purpose. And then coming to Queens, New York, and eventually having some things manifested in terms of police violence, and I saw some similarities. And so the fear transitioned itself, from Haiti to Queens, New York, and I became aware that I needed a place to put all of it. I didn't know, I grew up in a generation where kids didn't really talk to adults about things. You speak when you're spoken to, and so you don't necessarily, express. Your job is to be a kid. Don't worry about the adult stuff. And so, but I was always concerned. I was always aware of things. And so writing became this refuge for me. In a way, writing being a refuge for a refugee, right? Because I didn't really consider myself a refugee until recently, and probably the past 2 years, after having a conversation with a friend, says, if you leave under duress, and when you wanted to stay, that makes you a refugee. And I didn't really think that was me. I was like, well, we got on the plane, we had visas, so it didn't feel that way. But I think eventually when things kind of settled and I look back on those times, I realized that a lot of my first couple of years was spent missing Haiti a lot. And over the years, I started to realize that, no, you didn't leave under your own volition. You had to flee for your life, and then to come into an environment where it was just as risky, right, to walk down the block because of the inherent sort of culture of crime and and drugs that really invaded the communities back there in Queens, New York at that time.
Right. Yeah, being a refugee and not even really having a full appreciation for all of what that meant against your volition. And when we talk about that and trauma, we talk about when do we have agency and when don't we? And that sense of freedom that you're describing as a Haitian child, being able to go to neighbors and just eating and having them welcome you into their home is that kind of beautiful belonging that we all really long for. And, people's first idea of what it might be in a foreign land that our current White House occupant has termed a country of a demeaning name. And our prior presidents have limited immigration from based on, frankly, what appears to be no other reason as opposed to other Caribbean nations than skin color. That there really is a truth to what you're saying about the way in which there was a safe space there, and yet there was also this real piece of threat that comes in that then becomes the breaking. Again, with poet here on the Rerooted podcast, Enzo Silon Surin, When My Body Was a Clenched Fist, reading poetry from his new collection here, talking about his experiences growing up in Queens, in New York City. And I'm wondering if you might read for us a poem here on page 67, How to Nullify a Superhero.
Yes.
I feel like many children, boys could identify with some of what you're speaking of here.
you. And this poem is also an homage to the Haitians, as you see in there as well. Um, how to nullify a superhero. At the edge of a bed stoop, pillowcase cape, plunger as dagger, avengers of wrongs interrogating a whimsical city, filled with sirens and choppers, cops dwelling in dark alleys, stymied in ambush of ski mask robbers. Imagine your superhero telephone ringing, a frantic voice. Sean, who lived down the hall, in need of help to bolster late night raids, dreamt of being a cop. The remnant of NYPD blue wanting to bring solace to a uniformed hue, Haitian families akin to the Tonton Macoute. That would change. Call out to phantom crooks, lay down your weapons, your best Lionel from the Thundercat's voice, awing at a sky urge into clamor with your plunger, playing the part till the wind that framed your chocolate, milk mustache face tucked you into bed, a decade-long slumber. When you woke, Sean no longer wanted to be a cop. And your dagger, breaking news. Abner Louima arrested outside a Brooklyn nightclub, handheld radio and fist battered, later at a precinct, plungers handle, sodomy, later still, interrogation, his brown body sluggish as yours, eyes swollen in that eclipsed room, started fearing that you had entered the wrong skin at birth, into a blunt country, a barren world, musing on Batman and Robin. What did they do on their days off when out of frame with their utility belts in Gotham's twisted and dark alleys?
Hmm.
This particular poem was inspired by a question. It said, how come there aren't enough Black superheroes? And I thought about the question for some time. And I said, what way can I respond to the question that I felt like would do it justice? And I decided to write a poem because Black superheroes are discouraged. And there's a system that actually oppresses and suppresses any dreams of becoming a Black superhero. And so it becomes just like this fantasy, right, of a dominant culture to be the savior. Yet we are saviors of ourselves, but we don't fashion ourselves as superheroes because, again, we don't fit that, the model of the regular superhero. So,
Right. We don't fit the model of quote unquote the regular superhero, the normative superhero, the one
yes.
that is envisioned in perhaps the white mind. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what then, since then, of course, I'm sure since that original invitation, we've had Black Panther. So there's some of that, right?
Yeah.
Which is not the answer to everything by any means, but it's just
Right.
an invitation to maybe see that there's some shift there a little bit
Right.
in what's envisioned. But I love that. And I also just want to say that this Abner Louima assault, as horrific as it was, I mean, it really rings in our minds. Rodney King, Abner Louima. I remember for me, it was James Byrd in Texas with the dragging.
Yes.
That this violation of humanity, who does that
Mm-hmm.
to another human being? What powers take over your body to enable you to feel like you have that kind of superhero power to violate another life? And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, yeah, for you, how is that to reflect on this moment in time as a poet, as a Haitian man, as a Black man living in New York, in the United States, and well, now in Massachusetts, but really sort of, being with what this moment is, with the uprising and the protests?
It's triggering, if I'm going to be honest. And I think I find myself really digging deep every single time with the coping mechanisms, that I've developed over time. Plus also, my support network, close circle of friends, the kind of friends that you don't have to say anything. They kind of know what you're going through. And it just allows you to vent, to talk about it. But it is triggering in the sense that, time has had a lot of time has passed, but it seems that the system is still pretty much geared towards policing Black and brown folks in a very different way, in a violent way. And then the system punishes folks who actually, um, commit basic crimes, right? Like other folks, right? And so the brown, like a white assailant, or does not get the same um, restriction, even in voice, right? I used to, all those examples that you mentioned are really good, um, a good transition really into this book as well. And these things were happening in the background as I was experiencing some of the other social violence. And it became apparent, like, who do you call, right? Do you call the police? Because that poem was really focusing on the fact that these folks had uniforms and they had badges, right? And so in some way, cops were superheroes. That's why my friend Sean wanted to be a cop. And at some point we had talked about it as kids, said, well, you're going to be NYPD and maybe I'll
Mm.
do, transit police because I love the trains, And I said, we'll do stakeouts together. We'll be those different cops. And then slowly, you start to realize that undercover cops were, Black and brown were also getting treated in a completely different way. So it wasn't really safe. And so to have these situations happen now, and in the poem that was recently published on, on poets.org, I kind of asked a question. It's a poem titled When Nights Fill with Premature Exit. I said, is there a place where Black men can go to be beautiful?
Mm.
And I had been asking that question as a youth. Because I saw the way people looked at me. I saw the way the police looked at me, and always being visible, in that sense as a threat. Yet far from that, right? And knowing that I was doing all the hard work to not participate in violence, it was almost like a slap in the face, literally. Trying to be a good citizen, trying to be a good person, but you get treated as an enemy. And that does something to you. And so you have to dig deep within yourself to find a way to protect whatever humanity that your parents had placed in you, that Haiti had placed in me. And so no matter where I am, no matter how strange the situation is, how tough it is, the metaphor of the fist is really trying to protect something inside. And I carried that with me for
Mm.
as long as I could, even for moments like this, right? That I can say to myself, no, I'm in a really good place now to be a good shield for my two sons who are Black, And so how do you go through this world saying, man, how is it that my sons are going to go through similar things that I went through as a child? Like, when will the cycle end, right? When will it break? And how much work are we going to have to do? I'm kind of hopeful, right? Because the shift that I've seen culturally is a little bit different than what we're used to, right? Because even with Rodney King and all those other incidents, we saw minor changes to policies, but the police went on doing whatever it is that they wanted to do. But now you have this shift where multiple generations are actually coming together and saying, we're not going to take this, we're not going to accept this. But it's still to be seen, right? It still needs to be proven that we are actually citizens of this world as well. And when are we going to be treated as such?
We're still citizens of this world, and when are we going to be treated as such? As my friend Lamarat Owen says, I don't get to consent to how other people view me.
Mm. Yes.
And for those who, are more familiar with the vernacular around gender pronouns and sexual orientation and non-binary and the spectrum of sexuality and whatnot. It's called gender reassignment surgery, affirmation surgery. It's the assignment that you get. I'm assigned to be a boy or a girl by a doctor when I come out of my mother's womb based on my anatomy. But if I don't feel that way inside and I'm still given that assignment, then I'm a man because I have a penis. What does it mean to be a man, right?
Yeah.
That I don't feel whatever that might be. I feel differently. That it's not really a different phenomenon. So again, I'm just trying to broaden this as, this is a thing about others putting their perspective on you. And as it pertains to race, as we know from neuroscience and we know from years and years and years of certain imprintings and years and years and years of continued legalization of the devaluation of human life based on constructed false racial categorizations and differences based on gradations in melanin in skin, how that was used to really deem and legitimize and legalize the enslavement and exploitative labor and human capital, people.
Yeah.
So to your point, when we're talking about poetry as a way through, as a poetry and writing as a creative process as a way through this, how do you see it as a restorative sort of coping, grokking mechanism that may heal not only your personal challenges, but also maybe the collective?
That's a good question. I think poetry makes it real, um, because I think most of the time you question um, your own hurt often. Does it really hurt as bad? Did this person really mean to hurt me? Did I see what I just saw? And then the world tells you you didn't really see what you just saw, or that you're exaggerating. And so you spend a lot of time really interrogating your own feelings, and the world doesn't necessarily reflect that for you. It doesn't give you that mirror that says, yes, I see you. This is exactly what happened. This is exactly what it is. And then when you grow up in, with a generation like with my parents, they were hardworking. And my father especially, represent that generation of, I'm going to do whatever it takes to feed the family. But I don't necessarily have time to sit down and talk to you to process feelings, right? And so it's one of those things that I learned, eventually as an adult to appreciate, in the sense that he was his own person and he was dealing with his own generational hurt or generational way of parenting. But when you look at it, who can you talk to? And the page was actually waiting, it was blank. It was waiting for my words. And I used to carry around these notebooks and I would fill them with words. And I actually started out not writing poetry. I started writing scripts, and I called them plays, but they were more like screenplays, versus stage plays. And I would involve, my classmates. And so I would use their names as character names, but a lot of them dealt with, drugs and violence and so forth. And I would bring the notebook, and one day a friend opened up the notebook and started to read it, and then another person started to read it. And before I knew it, the whole classroom was sort of anticipating what I was going to write next. And it was then that I learned this was a shy kid who, spoke with an accent. So I didn't really make that many friends or didn't feel comfortable. But when I wrote, it gave me confidence. And what I was writing about was the neighborhood. And it turns out that all those kids around me were going through similar situations, except they didn't see it reflected. And I realized the power of words in that situation, sixth grade, really, and trying to figure out, okay, maybe there's a way that I can continue to do this. And I was doing it for me. I didn't necessarily think that anybody else would connect with it. And it was the same thing with poetry. I started to write these, sappy love poems, my feelings are hurt, or it's sky is gray, but then eventually, till this day, one of the best comments that I've ever received about my poetry, and this is, topping I don't discourage awards. Please, if you want to give me one, I'll take it.
Sure.
But a friend came up after reading a poem, and she said, "Thank you for writing this because it expressed what I've been trying to express for years, and I just couldn't find the right words." And I thought that was the most meaningful thing anyone has ever said to me about poetry, because you write in a silo, you write quietly in their own space, and you don't think maybe this will connect with someone until they actually read it. And so, so I do think when you mention the collective we, um, I do write from that perspective because I come from a culture where it is we. We are a community. We're not necessarily looking out just for self. You better yourself so you can better your family, so you can better your community. And so, so this book is about my personal experience, but it's also about a collective group of individuals who were considered fists themselves. They were clenched fists, and some were a lot younger than I was. And when I met them, they had already been clenched fists, and it took me a while to, you know, for the metamorphosis to happen for me. And it took really one particular incident to really push me into it, which is the title poem for this collection. But words have a way of validating things for you, whether you share them or not. Writing them down helps you see that, no, I went through this. I know what I saw. I know what I experienced, even if nobody else believes me.
Yes, yes, yes. I went through this, even if nobody else saw, even if nobody else believes me. I have agency and I can put this on paper and I know what happened. I know my experience. I validate myself. It's like the Buddha. This is a network of mindfulness podcasts. And it's like when the Buddha touched the earth and, you know, sort of checked, you know, am I really like waking up? Like, is this really it? Will someone bear witness to my sort of clear seeing now? And, you know, Mother Earth trembled in response as to validate and say, yes, I see you. I hear you. I get you. I'm here with you. This is happening. This is real. And that your pen on the page is very much that way. This is my validation. This is my truth. This is the Dharma of writing poetry. Hmm.
And, and it's hard to think about whether or not your words will actually have impact on someone else, right? Because, and I think, you know, when we talk about validation, the toughest part is to write a book, right? And say, okay, I'm going to put all of these things together. But if you step back, the toughest part is to write that first line, because sometimes you face some really tough truths. And I had to face a lot of them in this book, and saying, no, it did happen to you. And to find the language of, you know, the traumatized was healing for me. And some of those books are, you know, are referenced in there as epigraphs. But, you know, Peter Levine's book, Trauma and Memory, and because I had blocked out a lot of things, and I didn't realize I had done so until I started to really slowly peel back the layers, and I realized that, oh, there's a reason for that. And I'm glad that I finally found the language. And then, of course, the body keeps the score. So it really tells you how the body really carries a lot more weight, you know, psychological weight, and not just physical weight, than we can ever imagine. And a lot of the hurts are in these pockets, you know, and they come from those experiences that are. I'm a much healthier person, I would say, physically, as a result of writing this book. And I'm hoping it does the same for other folks who feel seen and heard and validated by what I've written.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. It's a way of processing what's happened. And like you say, you know, there's this sort of useful forgetting where I
Yes,
needed to kind of not know until I was ready to know. And
yes.
now I'm able to know more so I can lean in more. And part of this writing, part of that process is that. Is there another poem you would like to read? Do you have a
Um,
favorite? Do you have a...
I do, and it's a poem that, and it's kind of interesting to even call it favorite, but it's the poem that was the toughest poem to write, and so, but I won't read all of the sections, but I will read two sections of it, which is my body as a clenched fist, and it sort of really transitions you from um, gives you an insight into the metamorphosis of how my body became a clenched fist and the incident that I kind of mentioned. So I'll read the first two, and then I'll sort of, hopefully get through this poem because it's still one of the toughest poems to read in this collection as well. Um, my body as a clenched fist. One, affliction. It was a gust, no, it was a burst of air that brought the coil to my hands time and again. And no matter what I did to flex it, it didn't budge. And almost always brought me back to Leon walking beside me. Then in one felt motion, not there, except for the treads of his shoes making its way down the street he didn't know was a one way, the wrong way. When he doubled back, it was clear that something cannibalized the way home. I vetted the treetops for a place to perch, a vantage point beyond the crowd that had gathered to watch the fight, but there was no fight. It was all one-sided. 7, strike that. 10, strike that. 18, strike that. 20 pair of fists and Timberland boots bear down into the boy, and the only sight of fight in him was his body balling up like a fist to brace the rush of even more fists. What could I do? What could have I done? They had begun to also cannibalize passers-by and onlookers. I did what was customary, collected faces for the diurnal course, when there'd be another way to put fears and the cheers into a vista that wouldn't involve more fists. That day never came. And when a fury this strong begins to court a young fist, when anger is calibrated with fondness for rancor, there is only one end. To fight monsters, you must yourself become a monster. 2, aftermath. There was no sign it ever took place. No dents in the universe, no visible wounds from where the paratroopers landed their blows. No traces of Leon, no parallel bruise in your ribs or spine, just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. No physical wreckage, shards of bone, no raging fire or smoldering carcass, just an echo in your bones and veins, and the fist you packed for the day, just sun, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. No shortcuts, same street, same trees, and you staring at yourself like the body's purpose was to harbor this universe of cavity, wide enough to muse. Maybe there was still a way, so certain there was still a way to walk away or undo what was done. But with no body, no witnesses, no one to talk to, no Leon back at school, no sign the universe was ever disturbed except in your bones. And in the loaded fist you carried in your pocket, you sat in class, reviewed homework like you always did. Later at recess, in that odd, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun, whispering to the ball in your hand, shot taker and rebounder, because even at 13, you already knew that sometimes teeth are a gateway to the city of one's understanding, and other times they are a gate for what ails, and with no credible witness to corroborate, other than your own reflection in storefront windows, the ceaseless parading of two bodies, a balancing double-barrel pair of fists, you settled into the glaring aftermath, alone, glazed in that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. And it's really what happens when, again, you try to deny to yourself that it happened, but you walk past the same block, same street that the incident took place, and there's no visible sign. Everyone is going about their business, and you realize that something has changed in you. Something has been disturbed in you. There's no dents in the known universe, but there is in you, and your world changes forever. And so shortcuts and all the retreats or whatever it was, everything starts to stem from that. And I think um, it's hard to figure out when something starts, and to be able to go back to that trigger has definitely been quite healing for me, because it helped me figure out the reasons why I stayed away from New York City sometimes as well, or certain parts. Till this day, I haven't been back to that junior high school. It is my hope that, it was my hope before COVID hit, that I would reach out to them so I can come do a reading there, as part of the healing process to kind of come home. But I hadn't been back to that spot in a very long time. And not since I left the school. And so, so it kind of tells you how sometimes places still harbor the hurt, until somebody acknowledges what happened. And I hope by writing this that that I've done that.
Mm. I think you've shared your gift and you've shared your experience in a beautiful way with your new book, When My Body Was a Clenched Fist. Enzo Silon Surin. Am I saying it incorrectly? S-U?
Surin?
Surin.
Surin,
Surin.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
you're good. Yeah.
Somehow I'm saying SH like with there and there. I don't know
Oh, with the
why.
H, yeah.
I'm doing it. I know. Enzo Silon. Silon or Cylon?
Silon. Yeah.
Silon. Enzo Silon Surin. And I'm
Yes.
saying it again that way because I have to honor it. And I didn't really ask you the first time. And people sort of make a mess of my name all the time. And I really want to, even though it's kind of clumsy to do it here at the end, to just really name it. Enzo Silon Surin. Surin. See, I did it again.
Yes.
Haitian-born poet, educator, publisher, and social advocate, is the author of these two chapbooks, A Letter of Resignation, American Libretto, and Higher Ground, and the PEN New England Celebrated New Voice in Poetry, and the recipient of a Brother Thomas Fellowship from the Boston Foundation, and all other kinds of awards, and I'm sure more are forthcoming with this beautiful piece of work. Again, describing the experiences that you have as a living, embodied human here in the United States, as a Haitian American man, a Black American, a father, a son, and much more. So thank you so much for joining us here today on Rerooted.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Take care, Enzo.
Take care. You too.